So Harjeet, you take very much a regional overview in your work. How ready would you say Asian countries are to integrate climate change in their development planning and practice?
My experience of working with Asia makes me very happy to see the way governments are gearing up to understand what climate change impacts are on their development programs, on people, especially the most vulnerable people. And then they're also trying to make efforts in terms of setting up institutional arrangements, whether it is a department or bringing in the climate change research angle in their existing institutions. So the first step that they are taking is to understand the impacts on the ongoing development programs. Also different sectors like agriculture, water sector, and also health. So they are trying to see those kind of impacts, and then they are building their own strategies now to reduce the impact of climate change.
As you say, the populations of these Asian countries are being severely affected already by climate-related disasters. And with civil society having such an important role, do you think that Asian governments have opened the door to civil society consultation in planning for climate and development?
I think on disaster-related issues, governments have been very open to ideas, and thanks to some of the bigger disasters in South Asia and Southeast Asia, whether you talk about tsunami or you talk about Nargis cyclone or Sidr cyclone in Bangladesh. Civil society has been very successful in demonstrating that how working with the most vulnerable people like women, children, smallholder farmers, fishing community or elderly people. So how working with them and understanding their vulnerability has a huge impact on the success of the disaster response program, and then how preparing them takes them a level forward in planning for the future disasters. And it has actually reduced the vulnerability of people to future disasters. And now that knowledge is being used to integrate the climate change adaptation work, and it has also fed into the policy framework. So governments are recognizing the work of civil societies, even in countries like Myanmar or even in China after Sichuan earthquake. So that understanding is developing, and the space for civil society is really opening up. International community has to, one, put pressure on the north, one, to bring down the emissions, second, to generate resources which are much more needed by the developing countries, and make sure that the mechanisms are developed at the international level under United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to have a very democratic setup so that the poor countries are able to access that money. And plus, international community can also contribute in terms of capacity building of these countries, and also creating some knowledge platforms where South-South cooperation can happen, North-South cooperation can happen. All can learn from each other, because what we are talking about is climate change is a public issue, and we need to see knowledge as a public good, which is shared so that people are able to definitely take up more clean development pathways. We definitely have to see what kind of groupings can be made of different nations who have similar kind of capacities or resources or even knowledge, to bring them together. But at the same time, the scope of regional organizations are going to be extremely important. So if I talk about South Asia, so then SARC, the South Asia Regional Cooperation, has to play a major role, because it brings all these states together. And there is already a mechanism. I know it's not going great, but there is a mechanism, and the cooperation is growing. Similarly, ASEAN in the Southeast Asian countries. At the same time, we also have to recognize that the LDCs, the least developed countries, have a lot in common. So their issues also need to be highlighted, and they also need to be supported as a bloc. So on one hand, we have to look at group of nations in terms of their capacity, resources, vulnerabilities, at the same time without ignoring the regional political blocks, because that's what is going to keep them together. And in the country, if I talk about South Asia, then India can provide a lot of support to the neighboring countries. And similar things can happen in Southeast Asia, where countries who have more money, they support other poor countries, Cambodia, Vietnam. Now Vietnam is also sort of doing very well economically. So how they support their other countries. So we have to have this two-pronged strategy of working with these nations.